Hello, welcome to today's screencast. The focus is on sociocultural studies, paper 3, and we're going on to part 2. Before we go on to part 2, I'm just going to quickly have a run through what we covered in part 1. So we had a look at pre-industrial Britain and the history of sport moving through to 21st century Britain and those social and cultural factors that affected the characteristics of sport in that time period. Then had a look at globalization in the 21st century, and we also had a look at this idea of the impacts of hosting global sporting events. So from there, that's our first bit. That's been covered. Now we're moving on to part 2. Now, part 2 basically refers to contemporary issues, any issue in sport that takes place at the moment. So if we had a look into here, I've highlighted our first 3 topics. We've got drugs and doping in sport, violence in sport, gambling linked to sport, and then we go down into commercialism, media, routes to excellence, and technology in sport. So that's going to be our focus now. And if we go into here, just to give you an idea, these topics in part 2 will be sectioned. Okay, so we've got our first section is going to be ethics and deviance. So ethics and deviance is a real focus on this idea of rules and breaking the rules or adhering to the rules in sport. So as we can see here, when we look at things such as drugs, doping, violence in sport, and then gambling, these things will be considered in certain instances to break the rules of sport. And again, some of them will transcend both the rules of sport and also the rule or the laws of the land. So that's our focus now. We're going to go into our first topic today is going to be drugs and doping in sport, just so you can see where we're going across the unit. So first up then, drugs and doping in sport. So before we go into the specification, I'm just going to give you an example. So the use of illegal performance-enhancing drugs is really, really rife in modern sport, okay? And there are some sports that tend to have a reputation or a stereotype that basically groups them and links them to illegal performance-enhancing drugs. So if I said to you on here, we're going to start with this idea of cycling and a specific cycling event, probably the most famous cycling event in the world, the Tour de France. So what we're going to do then is have a look at some specific things about that. Now, you might have heard bits, you might have heard of cyclists such as Lance Armstrong, directly linked to the Tour de France. And what I'm going to do is just show you some examples of how much in the past events or cycling events like the Tour de France have been linked to illegal performance-enhancing drugs and doping. So if I put this on here, in the years between 1999 and 2005, I'm going to put this figure up. Of the top 10 finishes, okay, in each of those 7 years, okay, 61 out of 70 of the cyclists that finished in the top 10 each of those years, so 7 times 10 is 70, 61 out of 70 have tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs, or illegal performance-enhancing drugs. That is a ridiculous amount. Towards 85% of the people who finished in the top 10 have then either been found to take performance-enhancing drugs after or have had their medals stripped. And if you put this into perspective as well, if you consider Lance Armstrong, who was the winner of each of these Tour de France races, he had every one of those winning medals revoked due to being caught for taking performance-enhancing drugs. So you can see it's really problematic, this idea of performance-enhancing drugs, illegal performance-enhancing drugs. So what we need to do then is go in to have a look at what the specification requires us to know about this topic. So first up, let's have a look down to here. We need to have an understanding of the difference between illegal supplements and illegal drugs and doping. That's our first thing, because for this to be an ethics and deviance topic, the deviance aspect, breaking the law, we have to know illegal performance-enhancing drugs and doping and how they differentiate from these. On top of that, we then need to have a look at why do elite performers in the Tour de France choose to take performance-enhancing drugs, okay? Or why do they choose to dope? And then from that, we'll have a look at the consequences and implications of taking performance-enhancing drugs on the sport. We'll use cycling as our concrete example, but of course there are other sports linked to performance-enhancing drugs, society, the place that we live, the people we live with, and performers. Those individual performers, if they take performance-enhancing drugs, what are the issues for them? Finally, we'll have a look at the strategies to stop the use of illegal performance-enhancing drugs and doping, okay, and whether they're successful or not. So let's have a move into first things first then. So if we start off, what I'm going to do is just put down onto here some examples of legal supplements versus illegal drugs and doping. I'm pretty sure people will be able to recognize some of these, and you'll certainly cover these on other areas of your course, particularly on paper 1, exercise physiology. So I'll put into here illegal drugs. So you might have heard some of these. We've got anabolic steroids, EPO, blood doping, human growth hormone. These are examples of illegal performance enhancing drugs. Now from here, you can just make a note of these at the moment, and we'll cover them in more detail when we go on to paper 1. And then on top of that, we'll have a look at legal supplements. So some people might have experienced taking some of these themselves. Certainly things like caffeine, creatine maybe, bicarbonate, nitrates, and sports drinks. Okay, so some of these you might have had experience of taking. So we'll look at them a little bit more in the lesson, and we'll certainly look at them more as we go through the course. Okay, so there are legal supplements for illegal drugs and doping. That's important because some of these an elite sports performer can take. Some of them they can't take. But what is actually really, really important as we look through this is that it's not enough just to say, okay, you've got illegal you shouldn't take, legal you can take, because there are some disadvantages of taking legal supplements. Obviously, there are some advantages. So if we consider this, and I think the best way to do this is consider, okay, we should know certain things. If we're going to look straight away at the advantages of taking legal supplements, such as creatine, such as caffeine, such as sports drinks, what are they going to be? Well, if we compare that to illegal performance-enhancing drugs, the first one is that it's safer than performance-enhancing drugs, okay? So there's less health implications, you would hope. On top of that, okay, if you take legal supplements, there is no punishment. Now, that will be obvious, okay, because it's legal. So the IOC, who draws up the ban list, would say that they're legal, so therefore you don't get punished for taking them. So what I've done is I've put this in red, saying the big advantage of taking legal supplements, such as caffeine, are that they're safer than performance-enhancing drugs. But that is our start point. That's our pivot to get some disadvantages, because although they're safer than performance-enhancing drugs, legal supplements are less effective than performance-enhancing drugs, which is why some athletes don't consider legal supplements enough. On top of this, if we use this idea that although legal supplements are safer than performance-enhancing drugs, the key thing is the side effects that come from legal supplements are still there. You know, although they're safer, okay, there are still side effects, okay? And the side effects, I've just put one example here. So sports drinks, for example, could be linked to tooth decay. So you have, for example, professional footballers from a very young age will drink lots of Lucozade, like maybe 4-5 times a day at training, okay? And these can be linked to tooth decay, which can cause real problems in later life. And if we go down to here, the final disadvantage of taking legal supplements are some legal supplements have been found to have banned substances in them. So although they're considered legal, sometimes if you're not really careful with regard to where you get these legal supplements, if you get something that's badged up as illegal, there has been situations where banned substances have been found. So that's a really important point to have in there as well. So going on from here then, our next focus needs to be onto this. So we now need to think, now we know what the difference between legal and illegal supplement is, we now need to consider what are the reasons as to why elite performers use illegal drugs or they dope. Okay, so we'll have a look at this now. So if what I tend to do with this is say, right, if we can split this into the following, we're going to split them into social reasons, physiological reasons, and personal reasons. And the specification doesn't require you to do this, but I just think it just helps you. If you consider health as being your social, physical, and personal well-being, we can then start to think of some of the reasons why an elite performer would want to take illegal performance-enhancing drugs. From a social point of view then, there's this idea in elite-level sport, if you are going to be successful, you have to adopt a win-at-all-costs process, or sort of ethic, or win ethic. Okay, so win at all costs approach. And if you do that, that means that you will do anything to win. And sometimes that might mean trying to take illegal performance-enhancing drugs to help you win. On top of that, you might also, in a situation with Lance Armstrong, which we'll talk about in the lesson, sometimes you might have coaches or leaders within a team that put pressure on the performers to take them. So you might get pressure from coaches to take performance-enhancing drugs. And there's been lots of stories about this in the news with British Cycling, and also in the Lance Armstrong saga, where people were considered to be coerced or kind of forced into taking drugs to stay in the team. On top of that, we have this. Some people in elite level sport, particularly in cycling, thought that it was the only way to level out the playing field. So I said to you before, 61 out of 70 people, I think that was the figure I used, maybe a bit less, I'm trying to think what I put now, but a high number, roughly 85% of the people who got top 10 finishes had taken performance-enhancing drugs. The reason there's so many of them are taking it is because they think, well, if everyone else is taking it, I need to take it. So if we go down to here, the main reason why elite sports performers take performance-enhancing drugs, illegal performance-enhancing drugs, is the physiological benefits. So if you take performance-enhancing drugs, you might increase your performance. If I said to it in here, you've got to be specific here. So you might increase your strength via anabolic steroids, or you might increase your endurance by taking drugs such as EPO, which I'll have a look at in tomorrow's lesson. Final thing, the reason people take performance-enhancing drugs that are illegal is there are huge personal benefits or reasons to take them, because if you take performance enhancing drugs that are illegal and then you win, the results of that are you will increase your fame and fortune, and this might mean that this could be due to the fact that you gain a sponsorship, therefore, for example, in cycling you might think something like Oakley, Nike might sponsor you, and as a result of winning and taking performance enhancing drugs, that allows you to increase your fortune. Okay, so from here that will hopefully give you your first subsection on there. Our last little subtopic in this first drugs and doping video is going to be looking at the following. What are the consequences and implications of doping to sport? So as I said to you before, we had the Tour de France in cycling. Okay, so by having 61 out of 70 cyclists being caught in the top 10 performers of each, so you're looking at a huge amount of people taking it. What are the implications for the sport of cycling? So what I think it'd be quite useful to do here, if we have cycling here, I'm going to ask you to consider the implications on sport, or the consequences on the sport of cycling, using the golden triangle. Now, what is really interesting, you might have done this at GCSE, so if we consider the sport of cycling, when sport is contemporary, when it's professional, when it's commercial, okay, it has huge links with the media. For example, the TV will show the Tour de France on, say, for example, Sky Sports. It might be on Eurosport. They will pay to show it. On top of that, sponsors such as Oakley will sponsor cycling. But if people are caught taking performance-enhancing drugs, this can have a really negative effect. So this might lead to negative media coverage, or it might lead to media companies stopping showing sports such as cycling on their television platforms. On top of that, cycling might lose certain sponsors that are associated with them. Things such as Oakley sunglasses might not want to have anything to do with cycling if they are continuously having their high performers linked to performance-enhancing drugs. And as a result of this, what happens is there will be a decrease in the participation of people on the grassroots level in cycling. So this might low down. And then finally, this might lead to this idea that less people watch or spectate cycling. So if I flip this over to here, what are we looking at next? So if I took you on to the next bit, that is just me taking you through in a kind of a visual. Now what I'm going to do is take you through that one at a time. So the first key thing, then, if we use cycling as our concrete example, the first thing we're going to go to media here. The first implication or consequence of doping or illegal performance-enhancing drugs in the sport of cycling is they get negative media coverage. And I said, for example, cycling, you might say in the Tour de France. On top of that, we'll go down to here. They might lose sponsorship. So there could be a loss of cycling sponsorship. And I've said in here, for example, cycling may be losing sponsorship deals with companies such as Oakley, which have been directly linked to that sport. Now, from there, we're going to use these bits. If we have a negative media coverage, and we also, the sport of cycling loses sponsors. This then means you're getting less access to see sports such as cycling. Sponsors aren't putting the money into cycling. This might have a knock-on effect of decreasing participation in cycling. And as a result of that, or alongside that, I should say, this might stop people from watching cycling. So you get a decreased spectatorship. Okay, so that is what you're looking at here. These are the key implications or consequences of taking illegal performance-enhancing drugs on the sport. So we gave you that figure at the very start linked to the Tour de France. Now, if I just pick up where we started and said to you from here, we have had a look in this screencast at illegal supplements versus illegal drugs and doping. Might just be worth now, when I finish doing this bit, just thinking, can you remember the difference between those and those? And can you remember the advantages of legal supplements and the disadvantages? On top of that, can you remember the reasons why elite performers use illegal performance-enhancing drugs? Can you remember the three categories we talked about? Okay, so personal, social. Do you remember the other one? Okay, down to here, we had a look at the consequences of taking illegal performance-enhancing drugs on sport. Okay, so the sport of cycling, we used the golden triangle, and we looked at the negative effects as a result of that. Now, next screencast, we will have a look at the impacts of illegal performance-enhancing drugs on society. Then we'll have a look at the impact on performers. Finally, we'll have a look at what strategies are used to try and stop illegal performance-enhancing